Hey there, and welcome to another video. In this video, we're going to continue to look at how to use Bifrost USD in Maya. We've looked at the basic concepts, how to create a stage, layers, and how to add prim definitions. And if you've missed any of my previous videos, then check out my channel or go to the playlist that you should see here in the upper right corner of your screen. But now let's look at some asset workflows and how to set up and package them for loading and referencing into another 3D scene or USD stage. And for this video, we're going to look at USD purposes. Firstly, what are purposes? The purpose lets you classify a USD prim into visibility categories so that they can be included or excluded from the stage. And by using these, you can specify a prim's render fidelity in the viewport or final frame render. Let's use some production-based data as an example. This is the ALab scene, which is a free production-based dataset from the studio Animal Logic. It's a fantastic asset and free to download, and I'll include information links in the description below. Just be aware though, it's a very big dataset in terms of downloading, and because it includes all the high-res assets and also the high-res textures. Now, if we go to the top node in our outliner and select it and now go over to the attribute editor, there's an option here under stage display called purpose, and there's three options or three boxes that we can actually check. We have guide, proxy, and render. Now if I hover over these, we'll get a little bit of a pop-up and it'll give me some idea of what's actually going on here. But this is the USD purpose, and this is a specific USD term that you can find in the official USD glossary. Now we can see at the moment the option is set to proxy, which is intended for low res or lightweight rendering in the viewport. But if I turn this off, all the assets disappear. But then if I choose the render option, they'll come back, except they now have a higher quality. Now these are intended for final quality rendering when using something like Arnold. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm swapping out the low res versions for the high res versions. Now this ability is very useful for stages and prims because depending on your discipline and what you're working on, you might not require full res versions of assets. So you can revert to the proxy version to make your scene more manageable and lightweight. Now the other option is called guide, and that's useful for assigning a prim that can be used for markings or annotations or guides, and that can include things like curves and text. And you only really want to see them in the viewport and not in a final frame render. Now these purposes can be set up when creating your USD stage or USD asset. You can configure the entire stage or maybe multiple asset types, perhaps if you're preparing them to be loaded into a USD stage or maybe another stage in a different 3D package altogether. Now, these are specific and defined USD terms that are part of the USD schema. So if they're set up correctly, not only can they be loaded into Maya, but they can also be loaded into another package that supports USD. And if that package has fully integrated USD, then a user will be able to use the display purpose. Now this is a great example of how effective USD can be both as a format and framework. You can configure data in one package and use it in another, with all the setup and configurations being maintained. So let's see how we can use Bifrost USD to set up purposes on some USD prims, and then we'll export that data. So to create our asset, we're going to need a graph. So I'll do this now. I don't need the input node, so I can quickly just delete that. And what I'm going to use here is I'm going to use the add to stage node, just to keep it really simple. And the reason for doing this is if I plug this into the output, it essentially creates a USD stage for me in my Maya scene, and it also creates the MayaUSD proxy node up here in my outliner. Now, if I select this and go to my attribute editor, we can see that the USD properties have been set already, especially those around stage display and the actual purpose. We can see it listed here. But if I change these things around, nothing is actually going to happen because I haven't given it any data or instruction in my graph. So this is what I'm going to do now. But what this does show is that you can have an overall purpose for your stage defined at this top level, which is what we saw in the other examples, particularly with the ALab asset from Animal Logic. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a very simple ball asset, and we're going to have two branches of that asset. One that's going to be my proxy, which should really be my low res version, which is the best way to think of it. And then I'm going to have another branch, which will be my render, which is going to be the higher resolution version of the actual asset itself. So I first need to define a USD prim, and we do this by right clicking here on prim definitions, create node, define USD prim. Now at this point, I'm going to give this a name, a path name, we'll just call it geo proxy. And you can see under the general parameters, the purpose is actually defined here. And when I click this, we've got the options available to us. You'll also notice there's an additional fourth option called default, which is what it's set to when the node is created. Now that's not in the actual attribute editor that we just saw a moment ago. That's not really a problem. This is just a default setting. Now you can see this if we go to the info panel for this node as well. And if we just scroll down, we can see that there's some information here about the overall purpose. And it explains just basically what each one actually does. So if you set it to none or default, as it says, it means that no specific purpose metadata is being created. And essentially what this means is that your prim is just visible and that's it. Whereas if you actually set it as to render or to proxy, then that specific metadata is going to be defined for that prim. Now in this example, this is going to be our proxy version. So I'm going to go to my purpose and just set it as proxy. Now this means at this point that anything I add or plug into this particular prim node is going to fall under the proxy purpose. Now the first thing I need is some kind of visual representation for my ball asset, and the lowest res version of that will be a simple sphere. Now there's a number of ways I could do this. I could create a mesh in Maya. I could go to the attribute definitions and create a USD. So I go to the child and create a USD mesh if I choose to, but I'm going to take an even simpler option and change the type of prim to be a sphere, because USD allows us to set the type of a prim to be an actual simple geometric shape. So I'm just going to type in sphere here, and if I zoom into my viewport, we've actually got an actual sphere. What I'm also going to do as well is right click on my attribute definitions and define a USD transform. So we've got some simple translate, rotation, scale values. And I'm also going to do the same and create a USD display color. So this will give anything of my proxy purpose to be an actual specific color, so I can easily see it in the viewport. I'm just going to keep it the default blue, but of course you can set it to whatever color you want using the parameters up here. So these three nodes are basically my proxy prim. We can now go about creating the render version, which is essentially the high resolution version. But I'm going to do a little bit of tidying up here because I need a little bit more structure to my asset, and I really do need like a parent node up here where I can branch the proxy and the render purposes from it. So I'm going to unplug this and now right click on prim definitions, create node, define a USD prim. And I'm just going to give this a name and call this ball asset. I'm going to keep it as an X form. I'm not going to change the purpose. I'm going to leave it as the default, and that's it. Now, this is my proxy. I'm just going to plug this into here as a child. So I can now see it now in my viewport. Now I've connected my nodes up. And then from here, I'm going to right click on children, and now I'll create another USD prim, and this will be now for my render version. So as a path name, I'll give this, and I'll call it geo final. And then in my purpose, I'm going to set this to render. Now for the type, I'm not going to change it to a particular shape because the USD shapes are very simple. They're not really, they've got no detail there for me to actually use. So I need a higher res version of this sphere. And for that, I'm going to use the soccer ball in Maya. So polygon primitive soccer ball. There we go. It's going to create itself directly on top of the sphere at world center, which is what we need. And now I've got my shape in my outliner, and I just need to middle mouse click and drag it into my graph, and this will give me my shape node. Now at this point, I need to go to my children port here, right click this, create node, and choose define USD mesh. And then at this point, I can just connect this mesh directly into port here. There we go. So now I've connected my shape node in. I don't need it here in the outliner, so I can choose to hide it. Now, when I do this, you'll notice that soccer ball shape has disappeared. And why has that happened? Well, that's happened because right at the very, very top of our node on the MayaUSD proxy, remember it was set to proxy by default. So everything that goes up into our stage here is set to proxy as default. So if I just zoom in a little bit, so now if I unselect this, my proxy asset will disappear, and when I choose render, my final high-res version will appear. So that's it. The simple relationship has already been defined. These three nodes are my proxy version. These three nodes are my render version. This is the parent asset for the whole thing as well. I could actually just give this a USD transform as well. So it means I can move both the low-res version and the high-res version together as a group. But if I wanted to, I could also go to this node here and also give this a transform. So I can transform the render and the proxy version independently, but then I can also transform it as a group with this parent node up here. I'm going to flip this back to proxy because this will be the default setting I want. Now, this means that if I save this out, which is what I'm going to do in just a moment, that means that when I take this USD asset and load it into another USD stage, that could be in another scene of Maya or even another package like Houdini, then when I load that asset in, it will have the default purpose as proxy set automatically. Now, to save this out, I just need to add a save node up here after the add to stage. So I'll just tab this in now. Plug that into stage. The out stage goes there. And then at this point, I just need to define a path and a name for my asset and then save it out. So this is going to be the path name. I've defined a USD ASCII type for my USD asset because that will give me a text file. And then what I can do in just a moment is I can load it into a text editor and we can see how the actual data is structured. So if I just click on enable, that will save the data out very quickly. I'll just disable that. So it means that any changes I make right now aren't going to be saved automatically. And now what I'll do is I'll load this into Sublime Text. So here's that USD ASCII file loaded into Sublime Text, and we can just take a look at the breakdown and what's going on here. So straight away, this is the parent asset, the ball asset. It's an X form prim. And then underneath it, we've got our rotation, scale, and translation values. Then underneath that, we've got another prim called GeoProxy. We've got a display color. And then this is the important bit. The uniform token purpose is set to proxy. And of course, this is the transform values for that particular prim as well. Then going down, we've got another definition here, another prim called GeoFinal. That purpose has been set to render. This is the translation values for it. And then, of course, we've got a mesh. So this is the mesh that I've plugged in. And of course, we've got all the point value data for that as well. So it's a simple structure, easy to read and understand. And of course, this is one of the benefits of using ASCII files is that you can load it into a text editor and quickly debug it. So that's it. That's really the simple setup of how you define a purpose for your assets. And I've also saved it out. And now we've done the saving, we can do some testing. So we already saw that it works in our scene before by just going to the MayaUSD proxy node up here, attribute editor, flip the purposes, and I'm able to swap out between the two different versions of the actual asset itself. And now what I can do is I can load up another version of Maya and load that USD file in separately as an independent asset. So here we are in another version of Maya that I've booted up. All I did here is I went to create, universal scene description, and I created a stage from a file and I pointed directly to that USD ASCII file that I saved out a moment ago. And this is the result. And we can see in the outliner, the hierarchy is loaded, no problem. It's set to proxy by default, which is what we wanted to. So when it's loaded in, we're not trying to load in the full high-res version of it. And you can see we've got the actual USD structure here as well. And because we used the actual create menu, this is native USD data. No conversion to Maya data has taken place. Now at this point, I can go back to my attribute editor, turn off my proxy, turn on the render, and I can now switch between the different versions of my USD asset. So there we go. That's how you can use Bifrost USD in Maya to create a USD stage, but include and configure low res and high res versions of your assets and prims. So you can use whatever version is appropriate for what you're doing. This wraps up the video for today, but stay tuned to my channel because next up we'll be going through how to set up variant sets in Bifrost USD. In the meantime, if you want more Bifrost and USD tutorials, check out the links at the end of this video or in the description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.